Hello, my name is Alec Nicely, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the French Revolution. The French Revolution took place between 1789 and 1799 and involved the overthrow of the French monarchy, at least temporarily, and its replacement with a republican government. What is most important about the French Revolution, however, is not simply the change in government that occurred, but also the sweeping change in values and in what was viewed as necessary for governments to prosper. Now, though the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789 was sudden, it did not spring up out of nowhere, but rather been in the making for a little under a century. Before 1789, France was ostensibly an authoritarian monarchy, with the king ruling with absolute power over the entire nation. In practice, however, things were a little less clear-cut. While the king and his bureaucracy had significant power in Paris and the surrounding area, they also relied on the goodwill and loyalty of nobles and aristocrats to enforce their will in the countryside. Many regions of this countryside were separated from Paris not just by distance, but by custom and language, speaking various dialects or even German in some areas, and this could vary from region to region. This is all mentioned in pages 9 and 10 of Censer and Hunt's Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity, our main textbook for this section. In general, throughout France during this period, the king was viewed not as a despot or a tyrant, but as a sort of father figure, guiding his people politically and even spiritually. This is alluded to by Roger Chartier in Chapter 6 of his book, The Cultural Origins of the French Revolution, the chapter titled A Desacralized King. Even in the statements of grievance sent to the Estates General in 1789, which detailed various people's grievances, as the title might indicate, with the crown and with the nobles and their what was viewed as their transgressions against the people, and these were written on the eve of the Revolution in 1789 at the Estates General. The king's subjects still refer to him with reverence and esteem, and most of the problems are displaced onto the transgressions of the nobles, as mentioned earlier. However, as the Revolution approached, the legitimacy of the king's authority was increasingly bound to the happiness and freedom of his people, representing a king, to quote Chartier again, whose chief concern was his subjects' happiness. Yet as the French national debt increased, and fueled by the costs of the 7 Years' War and French assistance in the American Revolutionary War, and food shortages pressed on the French population, making life more difficult, the king's efficacy at protecting his people and making them happy was called into question. This was reinforced by the popularization of Enlightenment ideals, promoting freedom of press and speech, and using scientific principles to call into question the right of the monarchy to rule. Kings increasingly became more susceptible to public opinion, something which had never previously been an issue. This pressure eventually led to the decision to convene an Estates General in May of 1789 for the first time in over 150 years, since 1614. The Estates General, France's main legislative body besides the king, was comprised of 3 bodies, or estates. The first estate was made up of representatives of the clergy and the church. The second was of the nobility, and the third estate was comprised of representatives of everybody else, or at least 95% of the total French population, to cite page 4 again of the Censer and Hunt book. The first question at the convention in 1789 was whether to vote by estate, which would eliminate the power of the third estate almost entirely, as the first 2, the clergy and the nobility, usually were in agreement on most issues, or to vote by head, which would give the third estate the advantage. After 6 weeks into the the Estates General, even this first issue could not be decided, and the Third Estate broke with the others and formed the National Assembly. They were joined by the clergy shortly thereafter, and this National Assembly declared themselves the only authority capable of approving taxes, and swore not to leave Versailles, where the Estates General was being held, until a constitution had been written. While at first, outwardly, the king accepted the authority of this new assembly, he then ordered troops, many of whom were Swiss and German mercenaries, thought to be less sympathetic to the cause of the revolution, to Paris. These soldiers closed in on Paris streets and caused an atmosphere of fear and tension in the city as people worried that the king was conspiring to remove the National Assembly. This all came to a head when King Louis XVI fired prominent minister Jacques Necker, who was sympathetic to the Assembly's cause. Over 2 days, tension rose, and civilians clashed with soldiers in Paris until finally things came to a head on the 14th of July in 1789. On that day, angry Parisians stormed Les Invalides, a military hospital in Paris, and stole arms and cannon which they used to take the Bastille, a prison and ammunition storehouse in the city. The revolution had sort of officially begun at this point. What was most consequential about the events of July 14th, and what's kind of the recurring theme throughout, was not the violent uprising itself, which was haphazard and much of a hunger riot as anything else. What was important instead was the reaction to it, because patriots and those in the assembly seized on the revolt as an example of the swelling of popular opinion demanding revolution against the monarchy. And at this point, instead of the monarchy or even the deputies of the National Assembly determining the pace of reform and revolution, it was the people and the civilian population which was determining that pace and moving that forward. From this point, the National Assembly worked for 2 years to build a constitutional monarchy, which existed, if tensely, until 1791. On June 20th of that year, chafing under the new limits of his power, King Louis XVI attempted to flee with his family under cover of night and were discovered at the border. He was then kept under house arrest for another year until August 1972. At this point, the threat of war with Austria was looming, and the economic situation in Paris was worsening daily. So local neighborhood sections of the National Guard stormed the palace in August of 1972 and massacred the King's Guard, terrifying the deputies of the National Convention into voting on a new constitution. This, combined with the September massacres of over 1,000 prisoners, as many as 1,400, less than a month later in September 1972, sort of demonstrate the way in which the people, through popular uprising and violence, were pushing forward the revolution, rather than it being the assembly or the deputies involved, or even the king. And this drove the French Revolution more than anything else. And finally, on 22nd September of 1972, the French monarchy was officially abolished. This popular uprising was reflected in the fact that the Republic, which was created, placed a heavy influence not only on individual liberty, but on individual duty, presenting each citizen as having an integral role to play in upholding the democratic principles of the Republic. We can see this most clearly in Maximilien Robespierre, 1794, on the principles of the political morality. Here Robespierre, a leading figure in the revolution, calls on the citizens not just to participate peaceably in the Republic by voting and so forth, but also to defend it with force if necessary against the threat of counter-revolution. He states that to punish the, quote, to punish the oppressors of humanity is clemency, to forgive them is cruelty. So here he's sort of advocating violence, as we can see, and he's saying that we need to punish those who would usurp our Republic and who would destroy it, clearly calling for action against counter-revolutionaries. Now, this sort of vitriol and this sort of rhetoric led to, or was inherent in the Terror, which lasted from about September 1793 until July 1794. So his call to arms here echoes the mood of this day very well, since this was during the Terror. In this period, the French Republic was ruled by the Jacobins, whose political party, whose main aim was to ferret out counter-revolutionaries and put them to death using the machinery of the Committee of Public Safety. During this period, from, again, September 1793 to July 94, roughly 40,000 people were executed or otherwise killed, and many hundreds of thousands more, as many 300,000 more according to the Censer and Hunt book, were jailed. Those killed included many former heroes of the Revolution, such as Georges Danton, a former member of the National Assembly who was accused of leniency towards enemies of the Republic. The Terror was a horrifying example of near anarchy led by popular movement, and this can be demonstrated by Nicolas-Edme Retif's accounts. He was the novelist whose memoir we read. His experiences with a friend of his, referred to only as Mercier, who is named by the committee for having voted against the king's execution, and tells of Retif's own horror when confronted by a revolutionary patrol that he would be tried and executed despite any real clear indication of what his crime may have been, worried that even his mere association with Mercier may have been enough. So in this experience, this is reminiscent of other things you may have read about, such as the House Un-American Activities Committee or the Salem witch trials, events such as those, where popular uprising and popular uncertainty causes mass violence throughout periods in history. Now, in the interest of brevity, we'll skip ahead. The Terror ended in 1794 when it eventually consumed Robespierre himself, who was executed. And then after this, the National Convention, or the National Assembly, was replaced with the Directory, which was another Republican form of government, a bicameral legislature, which eventually itself became more and more authoritarian until eventually it was dissolved by Napoleon. Now, Napoleon is interesting because he, more than anything else, represents the way in which the Revolution truly changed the underlying ideals of how government was viewed. Because before, the monarchy ruled on the principle of divine right, that the monarch was the monarch and was the ruler because he had been commanded by God to do so, and he ruled with a sacred authority. Napoleon had no such principle. He ruled on a sort of the issue of merit. Napoleon presented himself as a capable leader and was always painted wearing lots of medals and in these triumphant poses. And this and other ways, and his libertarian ideals in many ways, appealed to the idea of popular sovereignty. So even though he was a dictator by all means, he was one who appealed very much to the idea that his legitimacy was based on the support of his people, which was an entirely new idea, something that monarchs before the revolution had never had to do. So in this case, Napoleon can be seen as sort of representing the way in which the revolution changed the underlying fabric of society, because from this point on, rulers now had to legitimize their rule in a way that they had never done before, and this was caused by that sort of commitment to individual liberty and duty and the part that citizens play in upholding their republic. Thank you very much. Again, my name was Alec Nicely, and that was my brief summary of the French Revolution.